The night my husband came home and told me he'd been sleeping with his new physician's assistant was a Tuesday in October. And I remember that because Tuesday was the day I always made beef stew. Slow cooker since 6 in the morning. Carrots from the farmer's market in Westport, the good kind that still have dirt on them when you bring them home. I'd lit the candles around 7, waiting. The way I'd been waiting for 2 years. By 11, the stew had been sitting unwarmed so long the carrots had collapsed. My phone was face up on the marble island, screen black. 3 texts from me unanswered. Are you stuck at the hospital? Should I save you a plate? Just let me know you're okay. I didn't send a 4th. I'd learned somewhere along the way that the 4th text is the one that gives them ammunition. The 4th text is what they bring up 6 months later at a dinner party, laughing. She used to track me like the FBI. When his car finally pulled into the drive, I was at the sink, scraping the stew into the disposal because I couldn't stand to look at it anymore. He came through the mudroom whistling. Actually whistling. He dropped his keys onto the marble with that little metallic thunk he liked and walked past me to the wine fridge. You're up late, he said. Not a question. I was waiting on you. He poured himself a glass of the Cabernet his hospital had given him last Christmas, the bottle that cost more than the heating bill. He turned around and leaned against the island and looked at me with this little smile I'd been seeing more and more for months. The one where the corner of his mouth pulled up like he was about to share a joke I wouldn't get. I need to tell you something, he said, and I want you to be an adult about it. I put the pot down in the sink. I dried my hands on the dish towel my mother had embroidered for me the year before she died. I turned around. Okay. I've been seeing somebody. Her name is Riley. She's the new PA on my service. She started in August. He took a sip of the wine. I spent the night with her last Thursday, and the Thursday before that, and I'm going to keep seeing her because honestly, I'm tired of pretending I'm not. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. You can scream if you want, he said, or cry, or whatever. But I'm done lying about it. I make the money in this family. I think I've earned the right to have a life that I actually enjoy. I nodded. Just once. Then I picked up the towel and folded it the way my mother had taught me, in thirds, and laid it on the counter. I picked up the pot from the sink, walked it over to the drying rack, and set it down. I wiped a water spot off the faucet with my thumb. Is that it? He said. What would you like me to say? He laughed. He actually laughed. I don't know. Something. Anything. Are you in shock or what? I think I'm just going to go to bed. He stood there with his wine and stared at me like I was a puzzle he hadn't expected to find on the counter. I walked past him, up the back stairs, into the bedroom. I closed the door. I didn't lock it. I didn't need to lock it. He wouldn't follow me because following me would have required curiosity, and my husband hadn't been curious about me in years. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for about 10 minutes. I didn't cry. I want to be honest with you here, because I've told this story to a few women now, and they always expect that part. They expect the breaking, the collapse, the night on the bathroom floor. There was no night on the bathroom floor. That night had already happened. It happened 7 months earlier, when I'd found the receipt in his coat pocket from the bar at the Greenwich Hyatt. 2 glasses of champagne. Charged at 1:47 a.m. on a night he told me he was at a conference in Boston. I'd cried that night until my eyes were swollen shut. I'd thrown up. I'd sat on the bathroom tile and wondered very seriously whether I'd wasted my entire 30s on a man who didn't even bother to hide his receipts. And then, somewhere around 4 in the morning, I'd stopped crying. And I'd opened my laptop. I'd started keeping a folder. I called it Tax Documents 2024 because I knew he'd never open a folder called Tax Documents. He hated taxes. He thought our accountant was a peasant. The folder had, by the time he came home and told me about Riley, 7 months of work in it. Bank statements. The deed to the house in Darien, which had been bought outright with the inheritance my grandmother left me when she died. A fact my husband had never bothered to remember because the money had moved through our joint account on its way to the title company, and he'd assumed, the way he assumed everything, that whatever passed through a joint account became joint property. It did not. New York and Connecticut both. Inherited assets kept separately documented, remained separate property in a divorce. My grandmother had been a court reporter for 31 years. She had taught me when I was 16 to keep every receipt. Write down where the money came from, honey. Write it down twice. The folder also had the printouts from the OBGYN where I'd gotten tested in May after I'd found the receipt, because I am not stupid. The folder had screenshots of the Venmo transactions I'd found on his phone the time he left it on the bathroom counter. $600 to someone named Riley M. In the memo line, just a single heart emoji. The folder had a spreadsheet of every credit card charge from the last 18 months that didn't match anywhere we'd gone together. There were a lot of them. There was a charge from a jewelry store in Soho for $1,800 on Valentine's Day, the same Valentine's Day he'd given me a card and a Trader Joe's bouquet and told me he'd been too busy to plan anything. The folder had a retainer agreement with an attorney named Margaret Holcomb in Stamford, signed by me in June. Margaret had been recommended by a woman in my book club who'd gone through her own divorce the year before and had walked out with the house, the boat, and her husband's retirement, all of it. Margaret was 63, smoked Virginia Slims out the window of her corner office, and had told me on our first meeting, "Honey, listen. The ones who tell you are easier than the ones who don't. The ones who tell you are giving you a gift. Wrap it up nice. I'd been waiting for the gift. Wrap it up nice. I'd been waiting for the gift. For 7 months, I'd been waiting. And tonight, he had walked into my kitchen and handed it to me on a marble counter. I didn't sleep. I went into the closet and pulled out the 2 suitcases I'd already packed in August, hidden behind the winter coats. I'd packed them the week he started talking about Riley by accident at dinner. Our new PA, she's so sharp, and the way he'd said sharp had told me everything. I'd packed clothes for 2 weeks. Toiletries. The jewelry my mother had left me, in a velvet pouch at the bottom of the smaller bag. The folder lived on a thumb drive in the lining of the larger bag, and another copy at Margaret's office, and a third in a safety deposit box at the Chase on Boston Post Road. At about 3 a.m., I heard him come up the stairs. He didn't come into the bedroom, he went into the guest room. I heard the door close. I heard the television turn on. He was watching something with a laugh track. I waited until 5. Then I carried the suitcases down the back stairs in my socks, one at a time. Slow. I put them in the trunk of my car. I went back upstairs and into the kitchen. I took my mother's dish towel. I took the framed photograph of my grandmother on the mantel, the one from her court reporter retirement party. I took the painting from the dining room that my sister had made me for my 30th birthday. I left everything else. I left the wedding photos. I left the wedding china. I left the wedding ring on the kitchen island, on top of a single sheet of paper that read, in my handwriting, "Margaret Holcomb will be in touch. The locksmith will be here at noon. Please be gone by then." Then I drove to my sister's house in New Haven and I slept on her couch for 14 hours. And when I woke up, she had made me coffee and asked if I wanted to talk about it. And I said, "No, not yet." And she said, "Okay." And we watched a baking show and I cried for about 40 minutes during the bread episode for reasons I still don't fully understand. I want to back up, because I don't think this story makes sense if I don't tell you who he was, who I was when I met him, and how someone smart ends up married to someone like that. His name was Tate. He was 31 when we met. I was 28. I was working as a paralegal at a firm in Midtown Manhattan that did securities work, which is exactly as boring as it sounds, and I was good at it. I had a 1-bedroom in Astoria. I had a savings account. I had a plan to apply to law school in the fall, which I never did. And that's a different story. Tate was a resident at NYU, going into orthopedic surgery. He was tall, and he had the kind of confidence that, when you're 28 and tired and a little lonely, reads as competence. He told me on our second date that he was going to make a lot of money one day, and he said it without embarrassment the way some men do, and I remember thinking good for him. I remember thinking that's healthy. I remember thinking he knows what he wants. I had been raised by women who knew what they wanted. My mother had run a small bookkeeping business out of our kitchen in New Hampshire for 25 years. My grandmother had testified in murder trials. I confused ambition with character. A lot of women do, I think. We got married 8 months after we met. I quit the firm a year later because he said the commute was making me tired and we should think about a family, and his salary was about to triple, and didn't I want to do something I actually loved? I said yes. I started a small business making custom photo albums for weddings, which I ran out of the guest bedroom of the house we bought in Darien with my grandmother's inheritance. I was happy for a while. I think the thing was, he never wanted children. He'd told me he wanted children. He'd told me he wanted children. After we moved into the house, I started seeing a fertility doctor on the east side, and after the fourth appointment, when the doctor told me I might benefit from a procedure that would cost about $12,000 out of pocket, Tate told me he wasn't sure now was the right time. Then he wasn't sure next year was the right time either. Then, one night about 3 years into the marriage, after a bottle of wine, he told me he'd never really wanted kids in the first place. He'd just thought he could grow into wanting them. He hadn't. Could I forgive him? He said. He hoped I could understand. I forgave him. That was my first mistake of the marriage. There would be more. By the time I found the receipt from the Greenwich Hyatt, I had forgiven him for forgetting my mother's funeral because of an emergency surgery, a surgery I later learned had been a routine knee scope he could have rescheduled. I had forgiven him for the time he told my sister, in front of me, that I wasn't really cut out for the working world. I had forgiven him for the year he stopped touching me entirely and told me, when I asked, that I had let myself go. I had not let myself go. I was a size 6 and I jogged 3 times a week, and I had the same body I'd had at 28, just with better moisturizer. But the thing about being told something often enough is that you stop fact-checking it. What broke the spell, finally, wasn't the cheating. The cheating I might have, God help me, tried to forgive. The thing that broke the spell was and I'll do it again. The little smile. The whine. The way he'd thought about telling me, planned out telling me, walked in whistling because he knew he was going to tell me, and he was excited. He wasn't asking my forgiveness. He wasn't even confessing. He was announcing. He was telling me how it was going to be from now on. In my house, the house my grandmother had paid for, and he was so sure of his standing in that house that he poured himself a glass of wine first. He had no idea what was in the folder. He had no idea I'd been talking to Margaret since June. He had no idea that the deed had my maiden name on it and only my maiden name, and that I'd never legally changed it on the paperwork, even though I went by his name socially. He had no idea that the joint account he was so proud of contributing to had been quietly drained by me. Twice a month, and to a separate account at a credit union in Stamford he didn't know existed, leaving exactly the amount he expected to see whenever he glanced at it on his phone. I'd been doing it for 7 months. I'd moved $143,000. None of it was his. All of it had originally come from rental income on a property my grandmother had also left me, which I'd been routing through the joint account because Tate had wanted us to look like a team, and I had said okay. And he had not once asked what the deposits were for. He had no idea about any of it, because he had never been curious. And on the morning of the day after he came home and told me about Riley, he woke up at 8 and walked downstairs in his bathrobe expecting coffee, and instead found a kitchen that had been emptied of every single thing that had ever belonged to me, and a wife who was, by then, 3 towns away, eating eggs at her sister's kitchen table. He called me 41 times that day. I didn't answer. I let Margaret answer. Margaret had been waiting. I want to tell you about the next 6 months, because the next 6 months were the part nobody warns you about. Everyone tells you about the leaving. Nobody tells you about the after. The after is paperwork. The after is sitting in a conference room in Stamford while 2 men in suits, Tate's lawyers, try to argue that my grandmother's inheritance had been commingled and therefore was marital property. Margaret slid the documentation across the table without speaking. The deposits had memo lines. The deposits had been logged by my accountant in a separate ledger for tax purposes. The deed had my maiden name. Margaret had a forensic accountant. Tate's lawyer stopped arguing after about 20 minutes. The after is also the lonely part. It's the part where you sit in your sister's guest room and you realize that for 9 years you have not had a single friend who wasn't also his friend. You don't know who to call. You start with the woman from book club. She comes over with a bottle of wine and tells you everything she should have told you 2 years ago. That Tate had hit on her, once at a Christmas party, and she hadn't said anything because she told herself she must have misread it. You tell her you don't blame her. You don't. He was good at making women doubt themselves. That was the only thing he was truly excellent at. The after is the morning you find out that Riley, the PA, is 26. You hadn't wanted to know. Margaret tells you anyway because it's relevant to a discovery filing. You sit with that number for about an hour. 26. The age I was when I first met him. You wonder if he had a type or if he just had an age, and you decide the answer is the second one, and you feel sorry for Riley for about 90 seconds. And then you remember the heart emoji on the Venmo and the $1,800 at the jewelry store, and you stop feeling sorry for her. You wish her well in your head, the way you wish a stranger well, and you move on. The after is also the things you didn't expect. The way the woman at the bakery you've been going to for 9 years sees you in line one Saturday and pulls you aside and says, "Honey, we always wondered, the way your sister's husband, a quiet man you had always thought of as just your sister's husband, sits down across from you at the breakfast table the second week and tells you, 'I want you to know that everyone in this family always thought you were too good for him. We just didn't know how to say it.' The way that hits you like an anvil. The way you cry into your eggs. The after is meeting your accountant on a Tuesday at her office to do a full reorganization of your assets, and her looking up at you over her reading glasses and saying, 'You know, you're going to be fine. You're actually going to be more than fine.' And the way you don't believe her at first. And the way, 6 weeks later, when she sends you the new projection spreadsheet, you start to. The divorce was finalized in March. I kept the house in Darien. I sold it in May because I couldn't stand to walk into that kitchen without seeing him at the counter with the wine glass. I bought a smaller place in Old Saybrook, on the water, with a porch and a row of hydrangeas and a kitchen that had never known him. I started the photo album business up again, but smaller now, just for clients I actually liked, and I made enough to live on, and the rental income from my grandmother's properties handled the rest. Tate did not do well. I don't take pleasure in this. I want to be clear about that. I have been told by various people that I should take pleasure in it, that I have earned the right, and maybe I have, but I don't. And I think that's because to take pleasure in it would be to keep him in my head, and I am tired of keeping him in my head. But for the sake of the story, Riley left him within 4 months. She had wanted, it turned out, a man who would marry her. He had told her he would. He had told me in one of the 41 phone calls I did not answer that he had never told her that. He had lied to both of us simultaneously, which I think is its own kind of accomplishment. Riley left for a cardiologist at a different hospital. Tate's surgical numbers dropped. There was, I heard later, a complaint filed against him by another nurse for inappropriate comments. I don't know what came of it. I stopped tracking him in October, exactly 1 year after he came home and told me about Riley. I had a hydrangea bush to prune. I want to end this where it actually ends, which is on the porch in Old Saybrook last August, almost 2 years after the night with the stew. My sister came down for a long weekend. We sat on the porch with iced tea, and she asked me, the way she'd been asking for 2 years, whether I was happy. And I thought about it for a while, because I've come to take the question seriously. I told her something I'd been trying to articulate to myself for a long time. I told her I didn't think happy was the right word for it. I told her I thought the word was quiet. My life had become quiet. I had stopped waiting. I had stopped explaining. I had stopped being a person who lit candles and made beef stew for a man who couldn't be bothered to text back. I had stopped being the audience for someone else's performance of his own importance. What I had learned, I said, was that you can't out-argue a man who has decided he's the main character. You can't reason with him. You can't cry hard enough to wake him up. He isn't asleep. He's just performing in a play you didn't audition for, and the only thing you can do is walk off the stage. You don't tear up the script. You don't try to get him fired. You just stop reading your lines. And eventually he looks up and the auditorium is empty and there isn't even anyone left for him to be mad at. You go home. You make yourself dinner. You light a candle if you want to, for yourself, because the light is nice. You eat your own food. You go to bed early. And the next morning, when the sun comes up over the water, it comes up on a life that belongs to you, and a house with your name on the deed, and a kitchen no one has ever yelled in, and a future that doesn't depend on someone else deciding to come home. That's the part I want you to remember. If you're listening to this and you're at the beginning of your own story, the folder, the quiet, the deed with your name on it, the grandmother who taught you to keep every receipt, the sister with the guest room, the lawyer who smokes out the window, the morning you drove away with 2 suitcases at 5 in the morning and your mother's dish towel in your lap. You don't have to scream. You don't have to throw anything. You don't have to give him the satisfaction of a single tear in front of him. You just have to be the person who was already writing it down. The one who heard the joke he was making at your expense and didn't laugh and didn't argue and just quietly, week after week, kept the receipts. And then, one Tuesday night in October, when he hands you the gift, you wrap it up nice, and you take it with you, and you don't look back. Looking back now, almost 2 years on the porch in Old Saybrook, I think the thing that saved me wasn't anger. Anger is loud and it burns through you fast and it leaves you with nothing. What saved me was something quieter. And I want to be honest about where it came from, because I don't believe in destiny and I don't believe anyone was watching out for me. My grandmother taught me to write things down. My mother taught me to fold a dish towel in thirds. My sister taught me by example that you are allowed to leave a room without explaining yourself. And somewhere between those 3 women, a long time before Tate ever walked into my kitchen with that glass of wine, I had been quietly handed the tools to walk out of it. Cause and effect. That's all this story really is. He treated me like background scenery for 9 years, and one Tuesday in October, I became scenery. He couldn't see well enough to notice I'd already painted myself out of the frame. He told me I'd let myself go, and so I stopped showing him the parts of me that were still standing. He assumed the money was his because it passed through his hands, and so I stopped letting him see what passed through mine. Every door he closed on me, I locked from the other side, and he never even noticed the click. I want to say something to anyone listening who's still in the kitchen, still lighting the candles, still waiting on the 4th text. You don't owe anyone a scene. You don't owe him a fight he can describe later at a dinner party. The strongest thing you will ever do is the thing nobody sees you doing. The folder. The receipts. The phone call to a woman who smokes Virginia Slims and tells you the truth. The quiet preparation of a life that is yours alone. Decency matters. It mattered to me that I didn't lie. I didn't poison him in the divorce. I didn't make up things he hadn't done. I let the truth do what truth does on its own, which is mostly to sit there until people look at it. That's the discipline part. Not screaming, not stooping, not making yourself smaller than you already feel. Keeping your hands clean isn't naive. It's the cleanest revenge there is, because when the dust settles, the only person whose face you have to live with in the mirror is your own. And the strength part isn't dramatic. It's the morning you wake up in your sister's guest room and put on real clothes anyway. It's the meeting with the accountant. It's the hydrangea bush. It's choosing on a Tuesday in October 2 years later not to track him anymore, because you have better things to do with your one and only life than memorize the weather in someone else's storm. You build it back, one quiet morning at a time. You become the woman your grandmother would have nodded at.